Chapter 2. Welcome to Quilst. Bright light flooded out of the doorframe, and Mally squinted, barely able to see as the wind grew stronger, whipping her hair across her face. She kicked out as she felt her legs lift off the ground, struggling against the invisible forces pulling her closer to the quilt. Her fingers were still glued to the tiny button, and she tried to shake free, but she couldn't let go. White light wrapped around her until it was the only thing she could see. Then just as quickly as it started, everything stopped. Mally blinked a dozen times. She closed her eyes, counted to 3, then opened them again. Nope, it's still there, she thought, gazing out at a lush green landscape stretching out to the horizon. Not just any landscape. It was the landscape. Somehow she was standing inside Grandma's landscape quilt. Rolling green hills stretched out for miles in every direction, but unlike the quilt top, they were broken up with large rocks, small glittering streams, and a variety of trees from scrubby bushes to massive oaks. Everything appeared to be made from fabric, yarn, and decorative threads. Long green yarn grass waved in the breeze nearby, and what looked like a stream rushed around a little hill carrying strips of blue fabric. Her hand gripped the silver button that had been stitched to the door block. It had transformed into a full-sized doorknob with a leaf shape engraved in the center. What in the world just happened? Mally thought. She still clutched her sewing box in her right hand, and her silver scissors were safe around her neck. I must be dreaming. I must have fallen asleep back in Grandma's sewing room with my head in a fabric basket or something. Or maybe this whole day has been a dream? But the doorknob felt so real in her hand. She turned and looked behind her, but could see nothing but empty white space filling the doorframe. She felt a gentle tug in her stomach that mirrored the feeling when she twisted the button on the quilt. If this is a dream, why does it feel so real? Mally wondered aloud. She took a cautious step forward. The door was set on top of a purple rectangle, exactly as it had been stitched in the quilt. Mally looked closely at the individual threads of fiber woven together to create the black fabric of the doorframe. Each seam was outlined with tiny white stitches. She leaned further out to get a better look at the millions of strands of green yarn forming the grassy landscape. Her hand slipped off the door, and it began to swing closed. Oh my gosh! She scrambled to catch it. The soft fabric pulled against her grip, as if it wanted to close. She set her sewing box on the ground and wedged it in place so the door couldn't shut. Then she cautiously walked around the doorframe, trailing her hands along the fabric. She peeked her head around the back side and gasped. She'd been expecting to see a tunnel or pipe, something to explain how she traveled here. Instead, the back of the door was a flat, black rectangle of fabric. From this side, it looked like a scary modern art sculpture perched on top of a purple platform. Mally backed away quickly and checked that her sewing box was still holding the door open. It was exactly as she'd left it, and a small strip of light glowed from the opening in the door. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the edge of the purple rectangle and bent down to run her hands through the grass. The fibers tickled her fingers. It felt overwhelmingly real. Where am I? Mally said, tugging on a strand of green yarn. Is this a dream, or am I dead? This place is a little empty for the afterlife, don't you think? A voice spoke behind her. I'd expect heaven to be quite a bustling place these days. Whirling around, Mally found an orange cat leisurely stretched out on a nearby rock. He closed his eyes lazily, clearly enjoying the warm sunshine. Who are you? Where am I? How did I get here? It took her a second to realize she'd just asked a cat a question, but he couldn't possibly talk back. She looked around, trying to find whoever it was who had spoken. The cat rolled over, drawing her full attention, and spoke in a low, bored voice. I think you already know the answers to 2 of those questions. He rested his head on his paws, clearly dismissing her. I think I'm inside my grandma's quilt talking to a very rude cat. Mally shook her head, but she had to admit it made this place a lot less scary to know she wasn't alone. Or maybe I've just gone crazy. Well, I'm sure you can go home and tell Mommy and Daddy all about it. I'm sure they'll make it all better. Yeah, right. She knew exactly what her parents would think if she told them about this place. Imagination Mally, Dad would chuckle, and Mama would tousle her hair, and that would be the end of it. They would never believe her. Except now she doubted Mama would want to hear a fun story. She rarely left her bedroom, even for dinner, and Mally hadn't seen her all weekend. Mally wandered down the hill to the little stream stitched into the landscape. Her heart rate had finally slowed, and the water looked so inviting. She sat down and peeled off her socks and shoes. Sticking her feet into the water, she was surprised by the feel of dry fabric against her bare skin. I guess water isn't wet here, Mally thought. It felt cool and refreshing, but when she pulled her feet out, they weren't dripping. Instead, a small strip of blue cloth dangled from one foot. She pulled it off and ran the soft fabric through her fingers. The edges were frayed slightly, and the color was mostly light blue with long streaks of lighter and darker shades. Something about that color brought back a memory of sewing with Grandma. It was a crisp, cold December day, and Mally was sitting in the window seat rummaging through Grandma's scrap basket. She loved running her hands over the fabrics, searching for the perfect colors to knot together. Grandma had several baskets filled with scraps, and this one was made from a braided rope stitched with red and green thread, like a Christmas cookie. Mally loved digging through the basket because Grandma had sewn a sachet of spices in the bottom, so it always smelled strongly of cinnamon and nutmeg. Mally could spend hours playing with Grandma's scraps. Sometimes she would braid them together to make a colorful rope necklace. Other times she'd knot the ends to make a chunky wig, so she could pretend she had long, thick hair like a princess. But on this particular day, she wanted to try something new. She set Miss Bunny on the windowsill and covered her lap with a large scrap of purple fabric. But the doll still looked cold. Grandma, can I make a quilt for Miss Bunny? Of course, Mally May. Grandma looked up from her sewing machine. Pull out the fabrics you like first. Then we'll cut them up and I'll show you how to sew them together. Mally selected her favorites from several scrap bins and carried them over to the cutting table. Are you making a bed quilt or a doll quilt? Grandma asked with a chuckle as she spotted the huge pile of fabrics. Is this too much? How much do I need? It really depends on your design and how big the quilt is going to be. I think a 9 by 12-inch quilt should be just fine for Miss Bunny. Pull out your 3 favorites and put the rest back. Mally did as she was told, and after a quick lesson on starching and pressing the scraps flat, Grandma helped her cut the pieces into long, straight strips using her special cutter that looked like a pizza slicer. Mally arranged and rearranged the rectangles a dozen times until the order was perfect. A bright yellow strip in the middle with blue streaked fabrics on either side. Now it's time for the best part, sewing your pieces together, Grandma said, setting down in her green chair with a sigh. She pawed through the drawer of a nearby purple cabinet and pulled out a pack of needles and a small spool of blue thread. She held them up for Mally to see. I think number 9 sharps would be a good choice for your fingers. And this thread matches the fabric, don't you think? Yes, but Mally was looking over at Grandma's sewing machine. We're going to do this by hand first. There's a lot more to it than you think, and it's easy to miss certain details when you're just pressing a pedal on the machine, Grandma said as her weathered hands pulled a needle from the paper packet. Aside from that, I have a cathedral window on the machine right now, and it's not going anywhere. She handed Mally the spool of thread and a small pair of scissors. Pull out a piece of thread as long as your arm and thread your needle. Then tie the ends in a knot so they stay together. Mally followed her instructions slowly. The eye in the needle was tiny. She licked her fingertips and twisted the end of the string to make a sharp point and poked it through the hole. Then she tried to tie the thread tails in a bow like her shoelaces. Grandma corrected her. Hold them together and tie an overhand knot like this. She made a loop, then passed the thread tails through the loop. Phew! Mally wiped her sweaty hands on her pants. This is a lot more complicated than it looks, Grandma. She picked up her fabric scraps and slid them together so the ends were lined up the way she'd seen Grandma do it before. She was impatient to begin stitching. We're just getting started. Quilting isn't something to rush, Mally May. Now let's mark the seam allowance on the edges so you have a line to stitch along. Grandma spread the middle yellow piece on the table and pulled out a ruler and pen from the drawer. We measure over from the side 1/4 inch. The pen made a scraping sound as she ran it along the edge of the ruler. Now you're ready to stitch. Hold the pieces right sides together so the edges are lined up. Grandma pulled Mally down to sit in front of her on the green chair. Mally breathed in her familiar scent of cloves and lemon and felt surrounded by comfort. Now you take the needle and start stitching right here. Mally inserted the needle in the upper left corner on the line marked on the fabric. Grandma held the pieces flat in her wrinkled hands so it was easy to take the first few stitches. Bring the needle up a little closer. There you go. You don't want monster stitches, Mally May, Grandma said. If the stitches are too big, it will allow the batting to leak through. What's batting? That's the middle layer of the quilt. It makes it puffy and warm, but it's not like fabric, so it can come apart if you don't make your quilt the right way. Mally tried to be patient. She took one small stitch, then another. It was just starting to feel easy when Grandma let go of the fabric. It's going to feel different now because you need to hold it all yourself, she said, giving Mally a little push in her back so she could rise from the chair. Go slow. Just take one stitch at a time. And with that, Grandma returned to her sewing machine and Mally was on her own. It was instantly impossible. Mally tried holding the fabrics together with her right hand, but the pieces kept shifting away from each other. The needle had felt comfortable in her fingers, but now it was like trying to wrangle a wet fish. Her thread tangled on one corner of the fabric and doubled back on itself, creating a wadded mess on the end. She ignored the mess and tried to make a few more stitches, but it only made matters worse. Ouch! The needle jabbed her finger and blood welled. Mally wadded up the whole thing and threw it as hard as she could. The fabrics twisted in the air and landed in an ugly heap on the floor. The sewing machine stopped, and Mally looked up to find Grandma squinting at her over the rim of her glasses. You're not giving up, are you? Mally scooped up the fabrics, and sucking on her bleeding finger brought them over to Grandma. I can't do it right without you holding it, she said, tears welling in her eyes. Yes, you can. It's not going to feel easy, but you can do this, Grandma said, looking at her messily stitched seam. You just need to slow down, and when stuff like this happens, she indicated the tangled mess in the corner, you stop and pick that out before continuing. Mally watched in horror as Grandma clipped off the knot and with a tug removed all the stitches she'd taken. The thread pulled out and the fabrics fell apart. The blue streaked piece fluttered to the floor. Why did you do that? I nearly finished that line, Mally cried. You've got to learn how to stitch properly, Mally. No shortcuts. No sloppy stitches, Grandma said sternly. Women used to depend on their stitching for survival. It's a skill to build, and you must earn it one stitch at a time. Dry your tears now. There's nothing to cry about. Tie another knot and try again. Mally scooped up the pieces and stomped over to the green chair. Why is she being so mean? She thought. pulling more thread off the spool with a jerk. "I just want to make Miss Bunny a quilt, and we could have it already done if she let me use that machine." She threaded her needle, managed to knot the end, and tried stitching the pieces together again. She instantly made another mess of fabric and thread. It was like she had 3 thumbs. She couldn't seem to hold onto everything without something slipping off her lap or falling out of her hand. It had been a relief when the truck horn sounded outside, signaling it was time to leave. Mally had stuffed the remains of Miss Bunny's quilt into the bottom of an empty drawer and hurried outside. Days later, she found the strips neatly folded around her needle and spool of thread. Grandma had set it in a corner of the windowsill so she could return to her project. But she never did. It was too hard, and her hands were so clumsy. It was so much easier to play pretend or watch Grandma than try to make something herself. For the first time since that day, Mally's fingers itched to hold a needle. Maybe it was being inside this impossible quilt land, or seeing the seams holding hundreds of fabrics together. Suddenly, she wanted to sew. She ran back to the door barefooted and picked up her sewing box. Propping the door open with her knee, she dug out a pack of needles and blue thread. She let the door close again against the box and returned to her spot next to the stream. She remembered how to thread the needle and tie a knot in the end. She picked up the blue strip and looked at it closely. Maybe I could stitch something smaller, like a butterfly. With a little snick, she tugged out the scissors from her necklace and cut the strip of blue fabric into 2 short links. Holding them together firmly, she began stitching along the edge. Her thread snarled up as it had done with Grandma before. She tried to take another stitch, and a large knot formed, locking her needle in place. "No, not again!" Mally tried to pick out the knot, but it was too tightly tangled. "You're not very good, are you?" The cat's voice called from behind. Mally glared at him. "This is only my second time stitching anything." "I can tell," he said, padding over to watch. "Clip that knot and start over. Don't waste your time trying to pick out that knot." "Fine." Mally followed his instructions and pulled out a fresh length of thread. "I can never hold the fabric right and the needle feels weird in my hands." "How many stitches have you made in your life?" "I don't know. 10?" Mally guessed. She inserted the needle along the edge of the fabrics. 10 stitches does not a maker make. It'll start feeling comfortable around 1,000 stitches. 1,000 stitches? It would take months to stitch that much. Mally nearly dropped the blue scraps. "It adds up quick if you stitch every day," the cat said, and Mally paused. She could have sworn that was something Grandma said, but couldn't be sure. She didn't have a ruler to mark the stitching line, so this time she just had to eyeball it. Thankfully, her thread didn't knot up as she stitched along the edge, but the line was far from straight. "Have you been drinking, little girl?" the cat asked. "What? No," Mally said, tying a knot on the end of the seam. "I can't think of another excuse for such huge, sloppy stitches." Mally ignored him and bent to root around in the stream, running her hands through the cool water fabrics until she located the perfect color, white with streaks of silvery gray on the surface. She pulled the fabric out and cut circles to stitch on her butterfly. Mally had no idea how to stitch the circles on properly, and one ended up much bigger than the other. She trimmed the blue fabric down until the shape roughly resembled a butterfly. "What in the world are you making anyway?" The cat just couldn't seem to leave her alone. "I'm making a butterfly, thank you very much. A pretty blue butterfly to enjoy this pretty dream, or whatever this is." "Oh!" Mally gasped as the fabric butterfly lifted off from her hand. It was moving. The creature rose several inches into the air, its wings fluttering erratically. "How is it doing that?" Mally exclaimed. Before her eyes, the stitches holding it together widened. Gaps appeared in the middle of the butterfly's body. Snap! The threads broke, and the blue fabrics fell silently back into her hands. Wow! I had no idea that would happen. Will everything I make become real here? So it seems, the cat said, a slight frown wrinkling his fabric forehead. Have you ever made anything before? No, I've never done anything like this before. Mally looked down at her hands in wonder. This is amazing. She gripped the scraps of cloth and was suddenly sure this was the same blue fabric she'd picked from Miss Bunny's quilt last winter. She looked over the stream at the rolling hills rising to the mountains in the distance. Grandma made this quilt. This was her fabric and her stitching, Mally thought, as she reached out to stroke the chunky threads that added texture to the ground. What if? It was such a dangerous, delicious, wonderfully exciting thought. Mally almost stopped herself from thinking it. What if Grandma wasn't missing, or dead, or kidnapped, or any of the crazy theories Mama had come up with months ago? What if she was here, in this quilt? What if I can find her? Has anyone else come here? Mally asked the cat. An older woman, maybe? Makers come and go all the time, he said, standing and stretching his front paws with a shrug. All quilts connect to Quilst, one way or another. Quilst? Mally liked the odd word. The cat arched one eye as if to say, where you are right now. So Grandma could be here? Have you seen her? She's about my height, with white hair, and she usually wears a bright scarf. We think she was wearing a red quilted jacket the day she went missing. It was her favorite, and Mama could never find it in her house or car. The cat flopped back down on his side, clearly unimpressed. He caught his tail with his front paws and looked more interested in that twitching appendage than her story. Dream or not, Mally was about done with the snarky cat, but she couldn't seem to stop the flood of words streaming out of her mouth. Her name is Grace Wright. She made this quilt. So that makes her a maker, right? I saw this fabric in her sewing room and stitched it with her. Have you seen her? She went missing 6 months ago, and no one has seen her since. No one saw her leave the house, and the police haven't found anything. It's like she disappeared into thin air. Poof! She threw up her hands and her fabrics went flying. Great maker. What did I do to deserve this penance? The cat replied, his eyes rolling to the heavens as Mally scrambled to retrieve her scraps. Just a few minutes ago you were convinced you were dead or dreaming. Now you've decided your missing granny is vacationing here, of all places. I have no idea what you're talking about. He rose as if to walk away, and Mally panicked. No, don't go! Please help me! She dashed forward, her hands outstretched, but he disappeared with a flick of his red-tipped tail. She fell to her knees on the ground and began to cry. Please, I need your help! She clutched the blue cloth to her heart as tears coursed down her cheeks. She blubbered on, hoping the cat was still listening. I really, really need to find my grandma. She's been missing for so long, and now something is wrong with Mama, and it's all messed up. Everything is awful, and it would all be better again if Grandma could just come home. Please help me. Her words dissolved into a simple chant. Please help me. Please help me. Mally wrapped her arms around her chest and rocked back and forth. Please help me. Please help me. Is this what you usually do when things don't go your way? Sit down and cry about it? The cat asked from behind. Mally whipped her head around and found he was now perched on the hill between the stream and the door. I don't know what else to do, Mally sobbed. Can't you help me? You know, I might have heard a story about a maker hanging around, but if you're just going to sit there and stain the fabric of Quilst with your tears, I'm not sure I should bother. Oh, stop crying! I'll do anything. Just please help me. Mally scrambled to dry her face. She considered using the cloth she'd pulled from the stream and thought better of it. She scrubbed her face with the sleeve of her shirt instead. Face clear, she stood up, tucking the precious blue scraps into her back pocket. "I'm Mally Spencer," she added with a shaky breath. "And you are?" "Very nice to meet you, Mally Spencer," the cat said with exaggerated politeness. "My name is Patch." "Patch the cat?" Mally asked, cocking her head to one side. "Yes, it's unfortunately unoriginal. A friend gave it to me and I didn't want to be impolite." He looked away quickly and shrugged. "A name is a name, after all. Who would I be without it?" Mally looked closer at his body and noticed he was pieced from a variety of orange, yellow, and red fabrics, cut in irregular sizes and shapes. None of his seams lined up, and some of them looked like they had been stitched backwards, with the edges of the fabrics fraying on the outside of his body. "Well, Patch, do you think you can help me now? Do you know where my grandma is?" Mally asked. "As a matter of fact, I believe I do. But I think it's best to leave that story until tomorrow." "What? No!" "Patience, little maker. You may want to think about taking yourself home. If your grandmother has been gone for months, time has most certainly been passing in your world." "How much time? How can you tell what time it is here?" Mally asked, looking up at the sky. The sun hadn't moved from its position directly overhead. "More than enough time for you to be missed, I'd guess." "Oh, no!" Mally scooped up her belongings and hurried up the hill to the door. She didn't think Rose would notice if she disappeared, but she didn't want to give Dad anything else to worry about. "What about Grandma? Where is the maker you were talking about?" she asked, shoving her feet into her shoes as she stuffed her socks, pack of needles, and spool of thread into her pockets. Patch followed at a slower pace, his tail twitching slowly from side to side. "Come back tomorrow and meet me there." He pointed at a spot in the distance. Mally could see a gray path at the base of the closest mountain. "I'll tell you everything I know." "You promise to be there?" "I swear on every stitch that holds me together." "Let's shake on it," Mally said, reaching out her hand. The cat stared at her with an odd expression. Slowly he padded forward and extended a soft yellow paw, which Mally shook once. "I'll come back as early as I can tomorrow. Thank you, Patch." Her eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of joy. "Just think, by tomorrow evening I could bring Grandma back, and then everything will be back to normal again." She stepped onto the purple platform and pulled open the door. Bright light spilled out, and a sudden wind blew against her back, pulling her towards the portal. Mally picked up her sewing box, and clutching it to her chest, she took one last look over the beautiful landscape. "I'll see you tomorrow, Patch. Thank you," Mally called. Then she turned and disappeared into the light. The return journey was just as odd and unsettling as before. Mally wished her hands were empty so she could grip her head as the wind swirled and a great ringing echoed through her ears. She closed her eyes tight as the light grew blindingly bright. Then, just as quickly as before, it all stopped. Mally blinked and found herself sitting on the floor next to Grandma's cutting table. "Whoa," she thought. "Did that really happen? Or was that all a dream?" She dug into the pockets of her jeans and breathed out a sigh of relief as she pulled out her socks and the scraps of blue fabric from the stream. It wasn't a dream. It was real. Mally sat and stared at the fabrics, her heart and mind racing at the possibilities. Grandma was alive. She was inside the quilt, and Mally just needed to find her and bring her home. "Mally! Mallory Lawrence Spencer, where are you?" Mally let out a little shriek as Dad's voice reverberated through the house. He was shouting loud enough to wake the dead, and Mally could hear his heavy footsteps stomping up the wooden stairs. "I'm here! I'm sorry!" She scrambled to her feet and snatched the sewing box off the floor. She flung open the door. "Oh my gosh, I have the most amazing thing to tell you!" Then she came face to face with Dad and Rose at the end of the hall. "Where have you been?" Dad demanded. "Rose said she looked everywhere and couldn't find you." "She must have missed me. She might not have been looking very hard." Mally smirked, but she lost her smile quickly as she caught her sister's eye. Rose's face was very pale, and she was staring at Mally like she was seeing a ghost. "I checked every room, and you weren't anywhere," Rose said. "Where did you go? Where have you been?" It was like Grandma all over again. Her last words came out in a whisper, and Mally was shocked to see tears in her sister's eyes. Rose had never seemed as sad about Grandma's disappearance as Mally or Mama. "I was just—" Mally wondered if she should tell them about the quilt. Would they believe? What if they took the quilt away? Grandma could be in that landscape right now. It was the first clue they'd gotten in all the months she'd been gone. If the quilt was taken away, Grandma would never come back. Mally shrugged her shoulders, trying for nonchalance. "I fell asleep reading a boring book from the library. I couldn't hear you all the way back here, that's all." "So you've been in the sewing room the whole time?" Rose asked. "Because I checked there too, Dad. I looked everywhere after you called." Both sisters looked at Dad, and Mally could see he still didn't believe her. Time to pull out the big guns. Mally crossed her arms and glared at her sister. "Did you look for me before or after you made out with your boyfriend in Grandma's kitchen?" Sometime later, Mally lay curled up on her bed, listening to the argument raging downstairs. Dad had blown his top when Mally spilled the beans that Rose had a boyfriend, and he had come over to Grandma's house. She hadn't mentioned his car or Rose ditching her at school, but she figured all that would come out eventually. When they got home, Dad had thrown a frozen pizza in the oven and disappeared into his and Mama's room. They had eaten dinner in silence, Rose glaring at Mally the entire time. When Dad reappeared, he'd ordered Mally to go upstairs and finish her homework. As soon as her door clicked shut, the yelling had started. Mally sighed and pulled Miss Bunny tighter into her arms. "I didn't want to tell on her, I really didn't, but Rose wasn't going to let it go." She threaded the rabbit's soft cotton ears through her fingers as she told her stuffed friend exactly what had happened that day. "And I really think she's there, Miss Bunny. It makes sense. She disappeared, and no one saw her leave the house or anyone come by because she never left the house. She's inside the quilt." Her mind spun with the possibilities, but the gentle gaze of Miss Bunny's black eyes always made her feel calm. She squeezed the doll a little tighter and felt the soft cotton squish against her face. "But why hasn't she come back yet?" Mally asked. "I was able to come back easily. Just walk back through the door and come home. It doesn't even hurt. You would think it would hurt, wouldn't you? I mean, it feels weird and it's kinda loud, but it doesn't hurt." She lifted the doll into the air and imagined her flying like the butterfly she'd stitched. "I just have to find her, Miss Bunny. I'm going back tomorrow, and I'm going to find Grandma and bring her home." She set her friend down carefully on her pillow and was just about to tell her about stitching the butterfly when she heard a low laugh from behind. "Talking to your stuffies again, baby?" Rose stood in the doorway, her thick arms crossed over her chest. "Go away!" Rose smirked. "No." She sat down hard on Mally's bed, making it clear she wasn't going anywhere until she wanted to. The bed dipped, and Mally scrambled off. She didn't want to be within hitting distance of her sister. She had no idea what was coming, but had a feeling Rose was looking to get even. Rose scooted forward to look at her closely. "So where did you really go today?" "What do you care? You were too busy dancing around for your boyfriend." Rose narrowed her eyes. Such a tattletale. Geez, when are you going to grow up, Mally? She picked up Miss Bunny and twirled the doll in her hands. Mally fought the instinct to snatch her best friend back. She hated seeing Miss Bunny anywhere near her sister's hands. As if reading her mind, Rose sat the doll on the bed and began sliding Miss Bunny's long ears through her fingers, exactly the way Mally liked to do. Playing with dolls is just so childish. You'd better be careful your friends never find out. You'll be the class baby. And talking to her? That's just weird. She picked up the doll by her ears and began to swing Miss Bunny around and around, spinning her over her head like a lasso. Mally screamed, "No, you'll hurt her!" But it was too late. Miss Bunny flew through the air and smashed against the closet door, landing in a heap on the carpet. Rose looked down and let out a surprised giggle. A small piece of brown fabric was still gripped in her hand. Mally's vision went red. She lashed out with both fists at her sister. She was a head and a half shorter, but her burst of anger more than made up for her size. Time lost all meaning as Mally punched and kicked. Strong hands suddenly gripped her shoulders, and Dad was yelling, "Girls, stop!" Mally landed one more smack to Rose's face before she was lifted straight into the air and set on her feet. Rose had a split lip and a series of long scratches down her thick neck. Mally's hair felt like it had been pulled out by the roots. "She attacked me! My lip is bleeding!" Rose yelled. "You killed Bunny!" Mally screamed back. Her body shook violently as she heard Rose's giggle play over and over through her mind. She thought it was funny. I hate her! I hate her! I hate her! What happened? Girls? Mally? What's going on? Mama stood in the door in her ratty brown bathrobe, looking lost and only half awake. Everyone went still. Mama looked terrible. She cut her hair very short in the middle of the summer, and Mally still had to look twice to recognize her. Her face was still beautiful, with high cheekbones and a widow's peak crowning her forehead, but it wasn't the same without her long brown hair. Mama's eyes were sunk deep into their sockets, and her skin was so pale, Mally wondered when she'd last been outside. Tears poured down Mally's face as she picked up the ear. "Rose ripped her ear off!" Her words came in gasps as she held up the scrap of fabric. "Rose, downstairs, now!" Dad barked. "It was an accident. Now!" Dad and Mama both yelled. It was a surprise, and Mama seemed to wake up slightly as she added, "You sleep on the couch tonight, Rose." "What? Why do I have to sleep on the couch?" Rose whined, but Dad had had enough. "Out!" He pulled Rose up by the arm and marched her out of the room. Mama bent down and picked up Miss Bunny from the floor. She sighed and sat down on Mally's bed and held out her hands for the ear. Mally didn't want to see Miss Bunny's head. What if it was all ripped apart? What if she was broken beyond repair? Mama took the scrap of cloth and stared at it for a long moment. "I'm so sorry. I won't be able to fix this as well as your grandma could." As Mama spoke, tears began running down her face. It didn't matter how many times Mally saw it. Watching her mother cry always made her want to cry too. Mama sniffed and wiped her nose on the back of her hand. "But I'll try my best." She picked up the doll and ear and wandered out of the room. Mally watched her go and wished for the 1,000th time that Grandma would just come home. Please, just come back home. The next morning, Mally woke early to find Miss Bunny nestled in her arms. She looked closely at her head and the place where her ear was attached and found a row of neat brown stitches holding it in place. Pure relief and happiness bloomed in her chest. Bunny was okay. She hugged her close and whispered, "I will never let that happen again." I'm so sorry, Miss Bunny. She looked at her doll again and met her comforting gaze. She imagined Miss Bunny saying, "It's okay. I understand. I forgive you." She threaded her soft ears through her fingers and was relieved to find it felt the same as usual. It still didn't make up for what Rose had done, but at least the doll wasn't broken beyond repair. Mally rolled onto her back and let her mind drift over the events of the day before. Here in her bed, she couldn't quite believe what had happened. The world seemed so normal, with cars passing on the street outside and the sun shining in the window. How could there be a whole different world inside Grandma's quilt? But it had to be real. Mally had slept with the scraps of blue fabric tucked under her pillow. She pulled them out and showed them to Miss Bunny. "I'm going back into the quilt today." "Quilst, I think that's what Patch called it," Mally said. "And you're coming too." She couldn't stand the thought of leaving her friend behind when she'd only just been stitched back together. She picked up her sewing box from the floor and dumped the contents on her bed. She sorted through the materials, then jumped off the bed to retrieve the supplies she'd stashed in her jeans pocket yesterday. Gently, Mally tucked Miss Bunny in the sewing box and placed the scissor necklace between her skinny arms. She added all 5 spools of thread, her thimble, and a pack of sewing needles. Then she tucked in as many fabric scraps around the corners as she could. It was a tight fit, and she apologized to Miss Bunny for squishing her in. Slipping the box into her book bag, Mally assessed her situation. Would she need anything else in the quilt? She thought about the door swinging shut and had an idea. Dad would often prop the door to the hall closet open with the plastic wedge when he was organizing tools for a job. She dressed quickly, pulling on her best-fitting pair of jeans and her favorite long-sleeve red shirt. For once, she didn't have to fight Rose for the bathroom. She brushed the tangles out of her hair and washed her face, then raced downstairs to search the closet. She found the wedge on a shelf near the door and quickly stuffed it in the front pocket of her book bag. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled the zipper closed. She couldn't wait to return to the quilt, to meet up with Patch, and bring Grandma home. Mally would find her. She just knew it. Heading into the kitchen, she stopped in her tracks as she spotted Dad sitting at the table with his head in his hands. He looked up quickly as she walked in and shifted his hands to grip his coffee cup instead. "Morning." "Good morning," she said, carefully setting her bag next to the table so the metal box inside didn't make a sound. "Mama fixed Miss Bunny last night. She did a really good job, too. I can barely see the stitches." A strange look passed over Dad's face. "Better make yourself some breakfast, kid. We gotta get going." Mally couldn't help but express her newfound hope. "I think everything is going to start getting better, Dad. I can feel it." He stared at her blankly. Mally smiled and did a silly little dance and sang, "The sun is coming out today, today. The sun is coming out today." He chuckled softly and shook his head. "Gonna need a lot of sunshine to brighten up this place." Mally felt another burst of joy at making Dad laugh, even just a little bit. She made a bowl of cereal and sat down to eat, feeling better than she had in weeks. But her happy mood faded quickly as Rose wandered into the room. Her long hair was disheveled, and it didn't look like she'd gotten much sleep last night. I will never forgive her, Mally thought. Miss Bunny may be fixed, but she would never forget what Rose did. Rose sat down and Mally shifted in her seat so she was as far away from her as possible without falling off her chair. They finished breakfast in silence and Rose rinsed the bowls in the sink. Her sister's punishment must have been bad because she didn't call shotgun or make a single nasty comment the entire ride to school. Mally had to jump out of the truck and open the small door to the extended cab to let Rose out at school. Her sister's skirt was pulled up in the back and her thighs jiggled as she tried to tug it down quickly. Mally relished the sight of Rose's bright red face as she struggled to fix her clothes and carry her bags at the same time. Mally slammed the door shut, and just like magic, her happy, hopeful mood was back. She leaned against her book bag and felt the hard edges of the sewing box press against her back. It felt so good knowing Miss Bunny was with her, and in just a few hours they would be back at Grandma's house. When they reached her school, Mally leaned over and planted a quick kiss on Dad's cheek. "I love you, Daddy." He jumped a little, but then a tired smile spread across his face. "Love you too, baby girl. Have a good day." Thankfully, it was a good day, and even more thankfully, it passed quickly. For the first time since the start of the school year, Mally got through the day easily without even thinking about crying. It all seemed so silly now. How could she have ever thought Grandma was dead? She was so healthy and active. She'd hopped in her car and driven across 2 states to participate in a quilting shop hop once, with only a day's notice. Someone who did that couldn't just wander off and get lost in their own neighborhood, could they? The only hard part of the day was when Audrey asked about sewing costumes. Mally wanted to tell her friend everything, but she felt torn. What if she brought Grandma back today? She doubted they would have time to sew costumes before the Renaissance Festival. She wanted to tell her friend about the quilt too, but how? It sounded crazy even to herself. She compromised by showing Audrey her sewing box at recess. Carefully tucking Miss Bunny deep into her backpack, she pulled out the box and showed her friend the fabric scraps, thread, and needles. "Check out those scissors! Awesome!" Audrey said, lifting the silver chain. "Yeah, Grandma gave me those for Christmas last year." For once, talking about Grandma didn't make Mally feel like crying. "Here, you pick the fabrics and I'll cut out squares." Audrey selected a strip of pink fabric and a weirdly shaped scrap of teal. Mally hacked at the cloth with the tiny scissors, trying to cut squarish shapes the best she could. Then she pulled out the spool of white thread, needles, and showed Audrey how to stitch the pieces together. Sort of. Badly. "Is it supposed to be like this?" Audrey asked, wiggling her fingers between her huge stitches. "I don't think so. Does this look right to you?" Mally showed off her seam, which was curled up like a tube. For some reason, the thread kept looping over the raw edges of the fabric instead of forming a straight line. Both girls looked at their seams and laughed. Between the monster stitches in Audrey's patch and the snarled edges of Mally's, they were a sight to see. Even though it looked terrible, they kept stitching. Mally cut out more squares, and soon the ground around them was littered with leftover bits of thread and cloth. Audrey connected 2 squares together, then 2 more. "Can I do this?" she asked, holding the 2 pieces side by side so they formed a checkerboard with 2 squares of pink and 2 squares of teal. "Yeah, Grandma did that all the time. Just stitch along the edge the same way," Mally said. "That's a quilt block, but I can't remember what it's called." "What it's called? It has a name?" "Yeah, they usually do. Grandma was always piecing new quilt blocks and would tell me their names sometimes. I remember turkey tracks and churn dash and, well, that's about it." Mally sped up her stitching to catch up with Audrey. Her last seam was a mess of knots and loops, but by the end of recess they had both stitched 4 little squares together. Mally pressed the quilt block flat on her thigh. The seams didn't match up in the middle like Grandma's, but when she spread it out, the patchwork took on a whole different look. "Wow, it looks good from this side." "Just don't look at the back," Audrey laughed. "I think we need better instructions. That was a lot harder than it looks." She handed her quilt block and needle back to Mally. "We just need more practice," Mally said, thinking about Patch's 1,000 stitches. "I'll see if I can bring a book from Grandma's house. Do your grandmas sew or quilt?" "Maybe." Audrey crinkled up her nose as she thought about it. "We have one quilt in the closet with red baskets on it or something like that, but my mom never lets me touch it. Both my grandmas live far away, though, so I don't see them very much." The final bell rang, and Mally gathered up her supplies and stuffed everything into her book bag. Her heart pounded at the thought that very soon she would be back in Grandma's sewing room, back inside the quilt. Audrey noticed she was walking quicker than usual. "What's up? I'm not in a hurry to get on my bus." "I know, I'm just excited about getting back to Grandma's house. I'll find us some more fabric to play with tomorrow." "Yeah, I think we're going to need a lot to get any good," Audrey said, laughing. She waved goodbye and Mally broke into a run, loving the feel of her book bag banging against her back. She made it to the high school in just a few minutes and wove quickly through the halls. "Watch it!" A cluster of girls snapped as Mally shoved past them through the front doors. "Sorry," Mally yelled back as she broke into a run. She was nearly at the parking lot, excitement building the closer she came to Grandma's house. "Mally, wait up!" She heard a familiar voice behind her, but she didn't slow down. Unfortunately, her sister's legs were much longer than hers, and Rose caught up easily. "Hey, I waited for you," Rose said. Mally said nothing. She wanted to shove her sister away, push her down so she would shut up and leave her alone. Of all the days she could pick to pretend to be nice, why did it have to be today? She walked faster, ignoring her sister. "Why are you in such a hurry?" Rose said, laughing now. She's still laughing about it. She tore off Bunny's ear like it was all just a big fat joke. Mally sped up, running even faster now down the road. She saw the lights starting to change up ahead and had an idea. She slowed down as if she would stop at the intersection and heard Rose's pace match hers. Then at the last second, she charged across the street. The cars had just started to move as she flashed past. Horns blared behind her, but she made it across and kept running, turning the corner onto Spruce Street. Distantly, she could hear Rose yelling, "Mally! Mally, oh my God, that was so stupid! What are you doing?" Mally could hear panic in her voice, but she didn't look back as she put her head down and ran as fast as she could up the sidewalk. She got lucky with the lights on Elm and was able to cross to Maple Street without having to stop. She glanced back and couldn't see Rose behind her. Good. Sweat poured down her back as she hopped, skipped, and jumped her way up the cracked sidewalk on Maple Street. She nearly tripped in front of the spooky gray house, but managed to catch herself just in time. She was just turning the corner onto Oak when she heard Mrs. Whitaker calling, "Mally Spencer! Mally Spencer, what are you doing?" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker. I really have to pee," Mally yelled, not slowing down. "Oh, go on then, little girl." Mally was so shocked she almost stopped running. Mrs. Whitaker had never let her walk past without at least a 10-minute chat. She'll probably catch Rose, though, and she won't have such a good excuse. She grinned in triumph as she turned onto Grandma's driveway and gravel crunched under her sneakers. Mally reached the side door in record time. She pulled out her key and with shaking hands opened the door. The alarm blared, but she didn't bother entering the code. She unlocked the second door to the kitchen and rushed through the house and up the stairs. She slowed only as she neared Grandma's sewing room. Mally felt a mixture of excitement and fear as she turned the doorknob. What if I imagined everything, she thought. What if there isn't even a quilt on the table? She slipped inside the sewing room and shut the door tightly. The room looked just as it had the day before, and right in the middle was the cutting table, with the landscape quilt spread out on top. She crossed the room slowly, ignoring the sound of the alarm which had just doubled in volume. The lush green landscape stretched out before her, and Mally stroked her fingers over the even rows of green stitches. She barely noticed the line of cut stitches around the sun, or the new spider web stitched along the base of each mountain triangle. Her eyes were focused on the door block pieced to the left edge of the quilt. Please, please let this work, Mally thought as she reached out to touch the tiny silver button. Nothing happened. Mally gasped. Had it all been a dream? She had wanted it to be real so badly. And Patch, that snarky patchwork cat, He had said he would take her to Grandma. Had she just imagined it all? But then she gave the button just the slightest twist, as if she were opening the door. A smile spread across her face as a sudden wind blew through the room, pulling her against the cutting table. "I'm coming, Grandma. I'm coming to find you," she said, as the door clicked open. She leaned into the rush of air and left the real world behind once again.